Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010. This video is about the essay by Immanuel Kant, Fundamental Principles of the Metaphysics of Morals. So this, as usual, Kant's theory on ethics is a response to Hume. So Hume's theory of ethics was that it's not reason that guides the will, it's passion. Passion has a desire, and then reason must be the slave of passion. So Kant will say, no, reason is the governor of the will. And as a matter of fact, any action done out of passion or an inclination to do it, out of a desire to do it, has no moral worth. Only actions performed under the guidance of reason, under special circumstances, specifically that you can will that your action be translated into a universal law that applies to everybody. If you can do that, and that law would still be able to exist without destroying itself, as we'll see, then you can perform that action out of a sense of duty to the idea of law in general. I know that probably didn't make a lot of sense until we go back and read through this, but that is the basic dichotomy between Hume and Kant here. So just keep in mind, Kant is responding to Hume's idea that it's the passions that guide us, and reason is just a slave of the passions. Kant is saying, no, reason does govern the will. Okay, so on the top of page 508, Kant says, nothing can possibly be conceived in the world or even out of it which can be called good without qualification except a good will. Intelligence, wit, judgment, and the other talents of the mind, however they may be named, or courage, resolution, perseverance, as qualities of temperament, are undoubtedly good and desirable in many respects, but these gifts of nature may also become extremely bad and mischievous if the will, which is to make use of them, and which therefore constitutes what is called character, is not good. A little lower on that paragraph, he says, the sight of a being who is not adorned with a single feature of a pure and good will, enjoying unbroken prosperity, can never give pleasure to an impartial, rational spectator. Thus a good will appears to constitute the indispensable condition even of being worthy of happiness. All right, so it's not happiness that guides the will, like Aristotle said, like Epicurus said, and like Hume would not disagree, because happiness, the desire for happiness, is a passion. So Hume didn't point out that it's specifically happiness that guides the will, but just all of the different passions vie with each other to guide the will, and then reason serves them. But Kant is saying here, the only thing that's good in itself without qualification, is always absolutely good, is a good will. So, you know, there's the saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Kant would say, that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what happens as a result of acting according to a good will, because the goal of nature is a good will itself. So if the road to hell is paved with good intentions, then nature has fulfilled its purpose, because a good will has been created, and that it leads to hell is irrelevant. That's what Immanuel Kant is going to say. He says, in the bottom paragraph in 508, a good will is good, not because of what it performs or affects, not by its aptness for the attainment of some proposed end, but simply by virtue of the volition, that is, it is good in itself. And then he goes on to explain, even if you gathered all your forces, and you should wholly lack power to accomplish its purpose, if with its greatest efforts it should yet achieve nothing, this is a good will, and there should remain only the good will, not to be sure a mere wish, but the summoning of all means in our power, then like a jewel it would still shine by its own light, as a thing which has its whole value in itself. Its usefulness or fruitfulness can neither add nor take away anything from this value. So, why does he think a good will is the ultimate good in itself and not happiness? His reasoning is, on page 509, that we have reason. And then his assumption is nature has adapted all of our physical parts of our body for a very specific purpose, and everything that we have is specifically fit for its purpose. Our eyes are perfectly fit to see. This is his assumption. Our ears for hearing. Our legs for walking. So he's saying, why then would nature give us reason? Because if the ultimate goal is happiness, he's going to say nature would have given us an instinct, would have prescribed an instinct for us to guide us toward that goal, would have helped us reach happiness much more effectively. But nature gave us reason. And then upon further reflection, he says, you know what? Reason even sometimes makes us miserable. And we saw that with Voltaire, the story of the good Brahmin. The good Brahmin's reason supposedly made him miserable because it made him realize he doesn't have any good answers for any of these questions about the soul and the creation of the universe, just like the story of Malunke Buddha. Buddha said those questions are irrelevant to a religious life, which should be focused on ending suffering. Desire causes suffering. Your desire for answers to those questions is just causing you to suffer. So just extract the poison arrow of desire and don't worry about those questions. That's what Buddha would say. Kant here is saying, yes, reason does cause us misery, but we shouldn't therefore disregard the questions that it demands answers for. We should use reason to fulfill whatever purpose nature had to give us reason in the first place. And since we know reason isn't the best for guiding us toward happiness, it must be for some other purpose that nature gave us reason, and then he'll say that purpose is for the creation of a good will. That's the highest goal. So at the bottom of page 4 of 509, so I just summarized everything he said about nature and reason and instinct on page 509. That concept of instinct is important to keep in mind because we saw David Hume use that same concept, and that's one of the discussion questions. And I explained how that violates. On page 490, David Hume first brings up his concept of instincts originally implanted in our natures. Those are the calm desires that we mistake for reason. So it's really an instinct in our nature that's guiding us. Hume is saying we don't have an instinct that guides us towards the ultimate goal of nature, because if we did, nature would not have given us reason. So I've been over that a couple of times. We'll be going over it again when I go through these discussion questions, but these are subtle concepts, so just keep in mind Hume talks about instincts on page 490. Kant brings it up on page 509. And so we don't have an instinct that guides us towards the ultimate goal of nature. We have instead reason, which is this weak and meddling, bungling faculty that we have is very undeveloped. Then how come nature's given it to us to begin with? It would really screw up any attempt for us to be happy, so happiness can't be the goal. So then he'll go on at the bottom of 509 to say that this claim that reason reduces our happiness below zero sometimes is by no means morose or ungrateful to the goodness with which the world is governed, but that it means instead that there lies at the root of these judgments the idea that our existence has a different and far nobler end for which, and not for happiness, reason is properly intended, and which must therefore be regarded as the supreme condition to which the private ends of man must, for the most parts, be postponed. So he summarizes everything I just said in the next paragraph, which I will therefore read. For as reason is not competent to guide the will with certainty in regard to its objects and the satisfaction of all our wants, which it to some extent even multiplies, this being an end to which an implanted instinct would have led with much greater certainty, and since nevertheless reason is imparted to us as a practical faculty, i.e. as one which is to have influence on the will, therefore, admitting that nature generally, in the distribution of her capacities, has adapted the means to the end, its true definition must be to produce a will, not merely good as a means to something else, but good in itself, for which reason was absolutely necessary. This will, then, though not indeed the sole and complete good, must be the supreme good and the condition of every other, even of the desire of happiness. So, then he'll go on to say that reason recognizes the establishment of a good will as its highest practical destination, and in attaining this purpose is capable only of the satisfaction of its own proper kind, namely, that from the attainment of an end, which end again is determined by reason only, notwithstanding that this may involve many a disappointment to the ends of inclination. So it's not inclination or desires or passions that are guiding us towards the ultimate supreme good that nature has ascribed for us. It's reason alone that can do that. Now, the big assumption here is that there is some force of nature that has purposes in mind and designs nature to achieve those particular purposes. It's called teleological, telos, the end or purpose. This is a cosmology that thinks nature's guided by ultimate purposes. So there is meaning in the universe for Kant, which seems in some respects to violate his agnosticism about God when it comes to his writing. He believes in God, but he's saying, does reason prove God exists? Now maybe this is another book, and in the interim, he's somehow thought he's come up with a rational proof of God. I don't know, but he doesn't mention God, he mentions nature. So why would you refrain from mentioning God unless you didn't want to say that there is a supreme governor of the universe writing its laws for us? But nevertheless, when you say nature forms us, forms each physical thing for a particular purpose, and therefore gave us reason for a particular purpose, it's the same idea of a God intelligently designing the universe. So that is an assumption that he's working with, and based on that assumption, why did nature give us reason? It can't be to give us happiness, therefore it must be for some other purpose, which he says is to cultivate a good will, a will that's good in itself. Well, how do you define a good will? Well, there's some preconditions. There's three of them, in fact. One of them is that a good will acts only out of in accordance with duty, not out of inclination. So that's one of Kant's most controversial points in his ethics, his theory of ethics, is that at the bottom of page 511, well, he gives a bunch of different examples here, but he just says that an action has no true moral worth if it's done for inclination, only if it's done out of respect for duty. So, for example, if you take care of somebody because you love that person, that's a good action, but it has no moral worth because the motive was your inclination. You didn't do it if you didn't want to take care of somebody, ironically, and yet you did it anyway out of just a sense of duty, then your action has moral worth. That's what Immanuel Kant will say, because the goal of nature isn't to achieve any particular purpose through your actions, but merely to create a good will. And a good will is defined as a will that acts only out of respect for, well, he'll later say respect for the law, understood as the universal law, but out of a sense of duty. Duty alone, with no inclination, contaminating the pure goodwill. That's the first prerequisite for achieving this goodwill. You act only out of duty, not because you want to do something, which is controversial. That's one of the discussion questions also. The second proposition on page 512 in the middle is that an action done from duty derives its moral worth not from the purpose which is to be attained by it, but from the maxim by which it is determined, and therefore does not depend on the realization of the object of the action, but merely on the principle of volition by which the action has taken place. So, the maxim by which you determine to act, all right, what does that mean? And I will explain that, but the third proposition, before we explain this idea of creating a maxim, is the bottom paragraph in 512, which is a consequence of the two preceding. I would express thus: duty is the necessity of acting from respect for the law. Now that's an important concept. Respect, this feeling of respect. And I'll have to come back to that because the first point is this maxim, acting according to some universal maxim. So on the top of page 513, the first full paragraph, he says, a maxim is the subjective principle of volition. And so so how do you understand, if you look at the top of page 514, but what sort of law can that be, the conception of which must determine the will, even without paying any regard to the effect expected from it, in order that this will may be called good absolutely and without qualification? As I have deprived the will of every impulse which could arise to it from obedience to any law, there remains nothing but the universal conformity of its actions to law in general, which alone is to serve the will as a principle, i.e., I am never to act otherwise than so that I could also will that my maxim should become a universal law. Here now it is the simple conformity to law in general, without assuming any particular law applicable to certain actions, that serves the will as its principle and must so serve it if duty is not to be a vain delusion and chimerical notion. So, all right, how do you know what the law, so the idea of law in general. So this is like Plato's theory of the idea of the good. So the ultimate purpose of nature is to cultivate a good will. A good will is one that acts only out of a sense of duty and respect for the idea of the universal law, from which all other laws, all the laws of physics emanate from this absolute concept of law, and all the laws of morality. And when you act in accordance only with respect for that, then you have a good will, and you're helping nature achieve its ultimate purpose. Well, how do you know what the universal law is, Immanuel Kant? And he's already admitted reason is weak, and it would fail to if we had to depend on reason to make us happy. But what then is it suited for? What has it been adapted by nature to accomplish? For discerning how to act in accordance with the universal law. But reason will already tell us, I don't know what that universal law is. So Kant provides a practical shortcut for, even though you don't know what the universal law is, at least you can know what it isn't. And it would, you know, a law that destroys itself isn't the universal law. So here's his method on page 514. The shortest way, however, and an unerring one to discover the answer to this question, whether a lying promise, so he's giving the example of, can I will that it's okay to lie when you need to get yourself out of a difficult situation? Well, if you made that into a universal law, you can lie when you need to get out of a difficult situation. Would that law hold? Would it be able to exist as a universal piece of legislation? So he'll say, is to ask myself, should I be content that my maxim, to extricate myself from difficulty by a false promise, should hold as good as a universal law for myself as well as for others? And should I be able to say to myself, everyone may make a deceitful promise when he finds himself in a difficulty from which he cannot otherwise extricate himself? Then I presently become aware that while I can will the lie, I can by no means will that lying should be a universal law. For with such a law there would be no promises at all, since it would be in vain to allege my intention in regard to my future actions to those who would not believe this allegation, or if they over hastily did so, would pay me back in my own coin. Hence my maxim, as soon as it should be made a universal law, would necessarily destroy itself. So then up at the top paragraph on 515, he summarizes this in a single paragraph. He says, I do not therefore need any far-reaching penetration to discern what I have to do in order that my will may be morally good. Inexperienced in the course of the world, incapable of being prepared for all its contingencies, I only ask myself, canst thou also will thy maxim should be a universal law? If not, that it must be rejected, and that not because of a disadvantage accruing from it to myself or even to others, but because it cannot enter as a principle into a possible universal legislation, and reason extorts from me immediate respect for such legislation. I do not indeed as yet discern on what this respect is based. This the philosopher may inquire, but at least I understand this, that it is an estimation of the worth which far outweighs all worth of what is recommended by inclination, and that the necessity of acting from pure respect for the practical law is what constitutes duty, to which every other motive must give place, because it is the condition of a will being good in itself, and the worth of such a will is above everything. So that was a good summary of his argument. All right, and now, respect. Reason tells us we should have this respect for the idea of law in general. So I want to go back to that on the bottom of page 513. He says, it might be here, the bottom paragraph, it might be here objected to me that I take refuge behind the word respect in an obscure feeling instead of giving a distinct solution of the question by a concept of the reason. But although respect is a feeling, it is not a feeling received through influence, but is self-wrought by a rational concept, and therefore is specifically distinct from all feelings of the former kind, which may be referred either to inclination or fear. All right, so he's saying that any action done out of an inclination to do it, or a disinclination to suffer some consequences as a result of not doing it, any inclination at all, if it influences your will, it's deprived it of moral worth. You should only act out of respect for the idea of the universal law, the idea of law in general. And yet, isn't respect an inclination? Aren't you saying reason is the slave of respect, which is just another one of the passions? And then Kant says, it might be objected that I'm not giving a good definition here, but he says, yes, feeling is an inclination, but it is specifically distinct from all feelings of the former kind, which may be referred either to inclination or fear. So, if you act because you want something, that's inclination, that you desire it, or if you act because you fear something else, then that deprives your action of moral worth. Those feelings sap away, suck away moral worth. Respect is a feeling, but it's neither an inclination or a fear. Instead, he'll say it's both at the same time. So he goes on to say, what I recognize immediately as a law for me, I recognize with respect. This merely signifies the consciousness that my will is subordinate to a law without the intervention of other influences of my sense. So it's not his inclinations and fears, they come from sense perceptions, but respect, he's saying, doesn't. That feeling comes from rational analysis of life itself. Although, how can you analyze rationally life without including your sense perceptions? There's a question I would have. But continuing, he says, the immediate determination of the will by the law and the consciousness of this is called respect. So that this is regarded as an effect of the law on the subject and not as the cause of it. Respect is properly the conception of a worth which thwarts my self-love. Accordingly, it is something which is considered neither as an object of inclination nor of fear, although it has something analogous to both. The object of respect is the law only, and that the law which we impose on ourselves and yet recognize as necessary in itself. As a law, we are subjected to it without consulting self-love, as imposed by us on ourselves as a result of our will. In the former aspect, it has an analogy to fear, in the latter to inclination. Respect for a person is properly only respect for the law of honesty, etc., of which he gives us an example. Since we also look on the improvement of our talents as a duty, we consider that we see in a person of talents as it were the example of a law, for example, to become like him in this by exercise, and this constitutes our respect. All so-called moral interests consist simply in a respect for the law. All right, so he said a lot in there. Respect is the feeling you get when you recognize rationally that there is this universal law that you should follow. So isn't respect a feeling, and if feeling motivates the will, that it deprives it of moral value? He's saying no, because respect is a different kind of feeling. It doesn't come from selfish desires or fears. As a matter of fact, it's respecting this universal law that thwarts your own self-love. You have to be willing to even lay your life down to serve this universal legislation. And when you do that, you realize there is a universal law outside of me that forces me to acknowledge it, and that gives you this feeling that's analogous to fear. And yet you realize, your reason realizes, I want to submit myself to this universal law. And that you have a desire, I want to do it. That is a feeling analogous to inclination, but you have this fear and desire simultaneously in one feeling, which he's saying doesn't come from any sense perception, but is created by reason itself. But it's really not created by reason itself. It's created by reason analyzing this concept of a universal law. That universal law is what's good, and a good will recognizes that. So, this universal law that Kant is talking about is very similar to Plato's idea of the good, the absolute idea from which all other ideas radiate. And reason is you're supposed to use your reason to perceive how all of the material world is a shadow of this ultimate idea of the good and emanates from it. And the other ideas, for example, the idea of justice or the idea of beauty, are contained in the ultimate idea of the good. At the bottom of page 513, Kant is saying when we respect somebody, we're not respecting that person really, we're respecting the law of which that person gives us an example. So if we respect a great bodybuilder, you're not respecting that person so much as you're respecting the law of strength and determination and discipline that it requires to do something like that. So respect is a feeling you get when you're contemplating these absolute ideas, which Kant is calling laws. The law of honesty, the law of, the law of, and what is honesty in itself is what Plato would ask, is what he would depict Socrates asking. So this really harkens back to Plato's theory of these absolute forms, although he's not saying that. And he does talk about an instinct. And in the Hume video, I said what Hume calls these instincts implanted in our nature, which he calls the calm passions that are opposing the violent passions, but we mistake the calm passions for reason. And one of these calm passions is just the general inclination to good, to goodness. I said that's an awful lot like the idea of the good implanted in your nature, this instinct. So Kant is responding to Hume, but I think both of them are really saying the same thing here. What Hume calls these instincts implanted in our nature, Kant says, no, it's not instinct that's guiding us toward the ultimate goal of nature. It is reason, and yet he'll admit that reason is combined with this feeling of respect, and respect is recognizing these laws, these universal laws, which I'm saying are very similar to the instincts, these calm passions, or these instincts implanted in our natures that Hume talks about, and the absolute ideas that Plato talks about. When you recognize the absolute form of something, you instinctively have respect for it. And reason is what recognizes them. Hume talks about instincts. That violates his own empiricist philosophy. Can you see an instinct? Can you taste it? None of your five sense organs can have contact with an instinct, or a will for that matter, and yet Hume refers to both of those terms. And if you've got a will that's implanted with instincts, how's that different from Plato's concept of a soul implanted with absolute eternal ideas? It seems to be very similar. So that is a summary of Kant, and now I'll go through these discussion questions on page 517. Compare the decision procedure here with the passage in Sartre's lecture where he describes how we choose for all people when we make a moral choice. Are these views compatible? Why or why not? So that's a big question. Compare them. Are they compatible? Why or why not? So they have opposite philosophies. Sartre says there is no universal law. We're just created randomly into nature, and then we're forced to create our own law, to create what we are. And he'll say, not only do we create a law for how a human being should behave, for how we should behave, but every time we do something, it's as if we're creating a law for the whole world to follow, which is what Immanuel Kant is also saying. But Kant is saying, you want to create in your mind a universal, a maxim, a universal law that everyone would follow, not, however, because you're trying to guide everybody else, which Sartre says you inevitably do, and you can't help but feel that responsibility. Kant isn't addressing that issue. He's just saying you're trying to discover what is the universal law, the idea of law in general. And the procedure you can use is when you're trying to act, transform your action into a maxim that must be followed by everybody. The example Richard Bilsker uses is stay off the grass. You can violate the stay off the grass sign if you're in a hurry. You're asking yourself, should I just walk across this grass and get to the classroom because I'll be late if I don't? Well, can you will that your action be translated into a universal law? All right, whenever anyone is in a hurry, you can walk across the grass and violate the keep off the grass sign. Well, everybody would think they're in a hurry. Eventually, they'd walk all over the grass. The grass would be dead. Therefore, if you enacted that law, it would destroy itself. Therefore, you shouldn't do it. So for Kant, it's just a practical method by which to guide your own personal actions. Make it into a law that everyone would have to follow. If it can exist in that form, then you individually can do it. Sartre is saying there is no universal law. Therefore, because there is no universal law or a God to perceive this nature of a human being, we have to create our own nature. But when we do that, whether we like it or not, we're proclaiming to the world, this is how a human should act, because we can only act in a way that we think is good for ourselves. Why else would you do it? And therefore, we have created the idea of a human. It doesn't exist in God's mind. It exists through our own actions. This is the absolute way a human should behave. That's what we do when we act. All right, so are those two views compatible? I'd say they're compatible because you have to think, can this action be a universal law for everyone to follow? That's the same decision they both ask you to make. So yes, they are compatible, but the philosophies behind them are exactly opposite. And it's on page 133 or the bottom of page 132 to 133 that Sartre talks about that. So, discussion question 2. Kant's view is a deontological view, as is the position found in the Bhagavad-gita. What are the main similarities and differences between these two views? Explain. Okay, so both Kant and Krishna say that you should act not out of a desire for the fruits of your action, but only out of a sense of duty. Do it because it's your duty. So that's the main similarity. And the main difference is that Krishna claims to be the universal law personified. He's Vishnu. He's saying you should act out of devotion to me. Kant says act out of respect for the idea of a universal law, and Krishna says act out of devotion to me. Surrender yourself to me, and then you'll have no sin. Don't be swayed by any inclination to achieve any particular goal, but just, so at the bottom of page 377, Krishna says, your business is with action alone, not by any means with fruit. That means the results of your actions. Let not the fruit of action be your motive to action. Let not your attachment be fixed on inaction. Having recourse to devotion, O Dhananjaya, perform actions, casting off all attachment, and being equable in success or ill success. Such equability is called devotion. Action, O Dhananjaya, is far inferior to the devotion of the mind. In that devotion seek shelter. Wretched are those whose motive to action is the fruit of actions. He who has obtained devotion in this world casts off both merit and sin. Therefore apply yourself to devotion. Devotion in all actions is wisdom. The wise who have obtained devotion cast off the fruit of action, and released from the shackles of repeated births repair to that seat where there is no unhappiness. A little lower on that page, Krishna tells Arjuna not to be swayed by the boisterous sense desires. Restraining them all, a man should remain engaged in devotion, making me his only resort. For his mind is steady, whose senses are under his control, and that the ultimate advice was, make me your goal and be devoted to me, because I am the supreme soul from which all souls radiate and the supreme governor of the universe. So there's the big difference, is they both have this concept of a universal law and even a law giver, although Kant calls that nature. But in the Bhagavad-gita, Krishna says, it's me. And in Kant's essay, he says, reason doesn't know what it is. So that's why he comes up with this tactic of, well, just imagine creating a universal legislation. Would your law, the maxim by which you act, destroy itself if enacted? So that is the main similarities, I'd say, and the main differences. Kant doesn't talk about reincarnation, so, but the main point was they both say act without desire for your any fruits from your actions. Kant says you should cultivate a feeling of respect. Krishna says you should have a feeling of devotion to him, which is the same thing as what Kant talks about, respect for the idea of a universal law. It's a combination of fear and desire, and that is also the emotion that Krishna evokes in Arjuna later in the Bhagavad-gita. He presents his universal form, devouring all of the universe, to convince Arjuna that nothing you do on this tiny little battlefield is really ultimately significant. All these souls are eternal, and I'm going to devour their bodies anyway through universal time, so just act and do what I tell you because I tell you, and let the chips fall where they may. And so Arjuna feels fear, and yet he also loves Krishna, so it's very much like Kant's idea of respect. So discussion question 3 on page 517. Just as Kant's view on knowledge is a reaction to Hume, his view on ethics is too. Explain how this is the case. So I've said this before. Hume says reason should be the slave of passion on page 489. Kant says reason is the governor of our will. It's not the passions. He says that on page 509. But I pointed out that, Hume rejects the idea of universal legislation, the eternal fitnesses and unfitnesses of things. He's saying they don't exist. These absolute ideas of morality, which Kant is calling laws. Hume says they're not real, but then he talks about instincts implanted in our soul, which is the same thing as these eternal fitnesses and unfitnesses of things that Plato was talking about. So when Hume talks about instincts, balancing, a passion is an instinct, and the calm passions combat the violent passions, and we mistake that for reason combating passion. But reason is just a slave to the calmer passions in the instances when we say reason has conquered passion. On page 490, he talks about the instincts originally implanted in our nature. So in the middle of the page, now it is certain that there are certain calm desires and tendencies which, though they be real passions, produce little emotion in the mind and are more known by their effects than by the immediate feeling or sensation. These desires are of two kinds, either certain instincts originally implanted in our natures, such as benevolence and resentment, the love of life and kindness to children, or the general appetite to good and aversion to evil considered merely as such. When any of these passions are calm and cause no disorder in the soul, they are very readily taken for the determinations of reason and are supposed to proceed from that same faculty. Okay, so, but they're not. They're these calmer passions. And they're either instincts originally implanted in our natures or a general appetite to good. A general appetite is the same as an instinct. And notice the general appetite to good as such. So you have this instinct that inclines you towards the idea of the good. Oh, well, that's exactly what Plato said. Hume is saying, oh, don't let any of your passions or instincts guide you. Rather, you should be guided by respect for the law. Well, respect is a feeling, but it's different from the other feelings, which are either desires or fears, because it doesn't refer to the self. It refers to a universal law for which you'd even be willing to lay down yourself. Well, that's if you identify yourself with your material body, but if you identify yourself with an eternal soul that is radiating from the universal idea of the law in general, then your true self-preservation, your true self-interest is the same as the interest of this universal idea of the law. So in which case, respect would be referring to self-love and fear for pain of the self, but the self properly understood as being identified with this universal law. That's a step Kant does not take. He's still saying that you're separate from this idea of the universal law, which Plato called the idea of the good. But if you took that next step, then you'd see how he'd be the same as Hume, but Hume doesn't realize how similar he is to Plato, because Hume is saying these instincts guide us. Well, there's one supreme instinct, which is respect for this universal law. And a good will is a will that acts only out of this respect. So, I know that was a lot, but I've been going over this comparison of Kant and Hume throughout, so I think I'll leave it at that and go to discussion question 4. Kant says that your action has no moral worth if you have an inclination to do it, and it happens to be the right thing to do. It only has moral worth if duty is the only motivation. Do you agree? Why or why not? So whether you agree or not, you just need to understand why he would say, that your inclinations, your desires, or your fears shouldn't motivate your actions. If they do, it has no moral worth. So again, an example I used was if you take care of somebody because you love that person, Kant would say that's a good action, but it's not morally good because you're doing it not out of respect for the universal law, but because you have a personal inclination to do it. If, on the other hand, you take care of someone you'd really rather not, they're really sick, it's gross, but you just pull yourself out of your own selfish desires and perform the action, not even because you love that person, but because you know that the universal law dictates that you should act that way, then you're acting out of a pure respect for the law, and your action has moral worth. Aristotle would say that's horrible. Someone who acts courageously but inwardly they're terrified doesn't have the virtue of courage. Well, whereas for Kant, if they stand their ground and fight despite being terrified inwardly, they don't want to fight, then only do they have moral worth. If they fight because they like to fight, then they don't have moral worth. I think Kant is thinking of Jesus, because Jesus didn't want to die on the cross. He asked that this cup be passed from him, but nevertheless, not as I will, as you will. He's speaking to God. That, for Kant, is the ultimate example of a good will. You don't want to do it, but out of pure respect for the universal law, he acts. And there is one more discussion question that I do want to talk about, and that is from Grace Clement's essay, The Ideal Types of Care and Justice, on page 579, she says, or Richard Bilsker asks, he says, Clement offers Kant as an example of an ethic of justice. Explain in what ways this is so. So the ethic of justice and the ethic of care. The ethic of justice says we should act according to universal principles, regardless of the particular relationships of the people involved in a situation. And that's what Kant says. If you're using the ethic of care and trying to determine who's in the right and who's in the wrong, your own biases will get in the way. Your own inclinations will muddy the moral waters. Kant would say, regardless of who you're dealing with, always act only according to these universal maxims. And that is the ethic of justice. And also, I believe there was a discussion question, from Beyond Good and Evil on page 568, Friedrich Nietzsche, discussion question 4. What are the main differences between Nietzsche's approach and the ones seen in the selections from Kant and Mill? So we didn't read Mill. So what's the main difference between what Nietzsche said in Beyond Good and Evil and Kant? Nietzsche said, so I asked in the discussion forum to compare Nietzsche's slave morality and master morality to the ethic of care and the ethic of justice. And one of the points I was trying to make there was that master morality is, in some respects, is like the ethic of justice, but in another main important respect is like the ethic of care, because the masters do care only for the people they know. If they don't know you, you're outside of the sphere of their moral concern. They might treat you well, but they might not, and in either way, it doesn't have a moral bearing on their actions, your existence. Only those they know within their own aristocratic class matter. Everyone else is a means to their end. So they treat each other with equality and fairness, but they wouldn't think of making that fundamental principle. So on page 548, he's in the bottom paragraph, a few lines down, he says, as soon, however, as one wished to take this principle, meaning acting nicely towards people, more generally, and if possible even as the fundamental principle of society, it would immediately disclose what it really is, namely a will to the denial of life, a principle of disillusion and decay. So, Kant is saying the will, a good will, is defined by acting out of respect for the universal law. But I think the universal law itself, and Kant doesn't say this, seems like the will itself, the source of the will. So if we have a will, it's coming from this universal will, the universal lawgiver. And what Nietzsche is saying is this universal will to power doesn't want a person to act out of accordance to some universal legislation that holds equally to everybody. If you look at nature, what this universal will seems to want is for you to go out there and absorb and conquer as much as you can and let the strong prevail. The masters should rule, and the slaves should be used by the masters to create ever greater expressions of the will to power. So that is how Nietzsche differs from Kant. Okay, so that wraps it up for Immanuel Kant, and that wraps it up for all of these essays, because I already put up the video for Grace Clement and Friedrich Nietzsche. So if you opt to take exam 4, I hope these review videos have helped, and thank you for taking the class. And I will now get back to grading the rest of discussion forum 2 and 3 and journals 4 and 5 as we approach the end of the class on Sunday.